On the January 5, 1942, as exultant shouts of victory resounded in the streets of Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in his quarters aboard the flagship Yamato with a heavy heart. While his countrymen celebrated their string of unprecedented victories across the Pacific, Yamamoto instructed his Chief of Staff, Motomagaki, to begin preparing for the second stage of operations. The reports flooding in from the Philippines, Malaya, and points south painted a picture of unstoppable Japanese conquest. Within months, it seemed, the rising sun would fly over all of East Asia. But Yamamoto knew something his celebrating countrymen did not. This war, he believed, was a catastrophic mistake, and he had less than 2 years to prove himself wrong. The speed of Japan's conquests in those early months was nothing short of stunning. In the span of weeks, Japanese forces had swept across the western Pacific like a tidal wave. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins, its battleship row a graveyard of twisted steel and oil-slicked water. The mighty British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse rested on the ocean floor of Malaya. Manila had fallen. Hong Kong had surrendered. The Dutch East Indies were next. Everywhere the Imperial Japanese military struck, Allied forces crumbled. In Tokyo, the military planners were drunk on victory. The ardent nationalists wanted to press forward, to keep conquering while the momentum lasted, no matter how far it took them. But Yamamoto represented a different faction, one that had never wanted this war in the first place. His opposition to unlimited war with the United States and Britain had been so public, so vocal, that friends on the Imperial General Staff worried he might be assassinated by extreme nationalists. It was partly why he remained at sea, away from the political intrigues of Tokyo. Yamamoto's Chief of Staff, Admiral Ogaki, shared his commander's concerns. In his private diary, Ogaki wrote about the desperate need for far-sighted statesmanship following this first month of glorious victory. Those words, far-sighted statesmanship, were ones Yamamoto used constantly. He criticized the politicians mercilessly, particularly Prince Kono and others who seemed to have no endgame, no vision for how this war would actually end. 3 months before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had met with an old friend, Ryori Sasakawa, president of the ultra-nationalist Gokusui-Do organization. They met at the Imperial Navy Club in Shiba, and over drinks, Yamamoto laid out his vision of the war to come with brutal honesty. At first, he told Sasakawa, "We'll have everything our own way," stretching out like an octopus spreading its tentacles. And now, just 1 month into the war, the octopus was indeed spreading flat across the Pacific. But Yamamoto had also warned his friend that this euphoria couldn't last. The time for political action, he insisted, was the moment Singapore fell. That disaster would unsettle the British in India, making them willing to listen to peace talks. Yamamoto knew the British well. He'd been a member of the Japanese delegations to the London Naval Conferences of 1930 and 1934. He also knew the Americans, having served as Japanese naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. His assessment was stark and uncompromising. Once war was started by the politicians, Japan must win a major victory quickly. But when that victory was achieved, Japan would have only a year and a half to bask in glory. "We must get a peace agreement by then," Yamamoto told Sasakawa. He looked to his old friend to carry this message to the right-wing political leaders who controlled the government. By January 5th, that quick victory seemed within reach. The American battleship fleet had been devastated at Pearl Harbor. The British had lost their capital ships. Manila and the U.S. naval base at Cavite were in Japanese hands. Hong Kong had surrendered. New landings were underway in the Dutch East Indies, at Rabaul, and in the Solomon Islands. Yet for all this success, Yamamoto was dissatisfied. The Pearl Harbor attack hadn't accomplished everything he'd hoped for. The American aircraft carriers, the most dangerous weapons in the Pacific Fleet, had been at sea during the attack. They remained unharmed, a constant threat lurking somewhere in the vast ocean. What was needed, Yamamoto believed, was a spectacular achievement that would bring the Americans to the negotiating table. Hey, before we continue with Yamamoto's dilemma, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below with your location, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode in this series. The question before Yamamoto's planners was where to strike next. The army immediately vetoed his suggestion for an attack on the Soviet Union. Such a war would be fought almost entirely on land, and the army was already stretched thin in China and Southeast Asia. So 3 other ideas emerged from the planning sessions. Yamamoto's personal favorite was an audacious plan to attack in the Indian Ocean. The strategy would involve invading Ceylon, drawing out the British Far Eastern Fleet and destroying it just as he destroyed the American ships at Pearl Harbor. Then Japanese forces would push into the Middle East to link up with the Germans driving toward the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. The payoff would be enormous. The Japanese Navy would secure all the oil it needed for sustained operations. But once again, the army refused. A Middle Eastern operation was simply too ambitious, too far from Japan's supply lines. They wouldn't commit the necessary troops. That left two plans on the table. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo advocated for an attack on Australia. Their plan called for moving through the Solomon Islands, taking New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, thereby depriving the Americans of their forward base of operations. Some enthusiasts at Imperial General Headquarters were already designing occupation systems for Australia and New Zealand, confident that these conquests were inevitable. But Yamamoto didn't like the Australia plan. It would take too long, he argued, and still wouldn't be spectacular enough to halt American resolve. Yamamoto had studied the American character during his time in Washington. He knew the Pearl Harbor attack had awakened something dangerous in the American people, a spirit of vengeance that the Japanese military planners were learning to detest as they encountered American forces. The Americans, contrary to Japanese propaganda about their softness and decadence, were proving to be stubborn, resourceful fighters. It was becoming apparent that even the capture of Singapore, which fell on February 15th, wouldn't stop the Americans. Yamamoto wanted a victory so decisive, so crushing, that it would make it possible for Japan to extend a generous olive branch and negotiate a favorable peace. In January, Yamamoto ordered his staff to draw up another plan. 2 months later, he sent officers to Tokyo with a document designated the MI Plan. This plan envisioned a climactic battle of Midway Island where the American carrier force would be lured out and destroyed. Simultaneously, he developed the L Plan, which detailed an invasion of the North American continent via Alaska. If all went well, Hawaii would be occupied, and perhaps even the West Coast. At minimum, victories at Midway and in the Aleutians would give Japanese politicians a strong position from which to negotiate the peace Yamamoto desperately wanted. In Tokyo, the admirals quarreled around the conference table in the Navy Ministry, but in the end, Yamamoto's will prevailed. He was Japan's most respected naval officer, the architect of Pearl Harbor, and his reputation gave him leverage others lacked. Forgotten in all this planning was the potential significance of Singapore's fall in February, and the impending collapse of Bataan and Corregidor. Either of these might have served Yamamoto's diplomatic purposes, creating opportunities for negotiation. But they were no longer important because of what happened on April 18, 1942. On that day, everything changed. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bomber squadron appeared in the skies over Tokyo, and in the span of a few hours, shattered every assumption upon which Japanese strategy was built. The Doolittle Raid was born from desperation and audacity in equal measure. In the dark months following Pearl Harbor, American morale had sunk to unprecedented lows. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. The Philippines were falling. Wake Island had been lost. Guam was gone. Everywhere American forces engaged the Japanese, they were being pushed back, overwhelmed by an enemy that seemed invincible. President Roosevelt and his military planners understood that America needed a victory, any victory, to prove that Japan wasn't untouchable. More importantly, they needed to strike back at the Japanese homeland itself, to demonstrate that the vast ocean separating Japan from American forces wasn't the protective moat Japanese propaganda claimed it to be. The problem was how to do it. American carriers couldn't get close enough to Japan to launch their aircraft without being detected and destroyed by Japanese patrol planes and surface vessels. Land-based bombers didn't have the range to reach Japan from any base the Americans controlled. It seemed impossible. Enter audacious plan. What if medium-range army bombers could be launched from an aircraft carrier? It had never been done before. The B-25 Mitchell bomber was far larger and heavier than any aircraft that had ever taken off from a carrier deck. Navy pilots insisted it couldn't be done. But Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, a legendary aviator who held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT, believed otherwise. Doolittle handpicked his crews, volunteers all, for a mission so secret that they weren't told their target until they were at sea. Through February and March 1942, these pilots practiced short takeoffs, trying to get their heavy bombers airborne in the impossibly short distance available on a carrier deck. They modified their aircraft, stripping out excess weight, adding extra fuel tanks, removing defensive guns to save precious pounds. On April 2nd, 16 B-25s were loaded aboard the carrier USS Hornet at Alameda, California. The sight was surreal. These twin-engine bombers, designed for land bases, sat incongruously on the carrier deck, their wings overhanging the sides. Navy personnel who saw them shook their heads in disbelief. The Hornet and her escorts, designated Task Force 18, sailed west into the Pacific. On April 13th, they rendezvoused with Admiral William Halsey's Task Force 16, centered on the carrier USS Enterprise. Together, the combined force steamed toward Japan, maintaining strict radio silence. The plan called for the Hornet to approach within 400 miles of Japan, launch the bombers in the evening, and allow them to strike Tokyo at night before flying onto land at airfields in China. But on the morning of April 18th, while still 650 miles from Japan, the task force encountered a Japanese patrol boat. The Americans sank the vessel, but not before it radioed a warning to Tokyo. Admiral Halsey had no choice. The mission had to launch immediately, even though the bombers would have to fly an extra 200 miles, consuming fuel they would desperately need to reach China. At 8:20 in the morning, with the Hornet's deck pitching in heavy seas, Doolittle's B-25 roared down the deck and lurched into the air. One by one, all 16 bombers followed, their pilots fighting to coax their overloaded aircraft off the carrier deck. It was a testament to their skill that all 16 made it airborne. For the Japanese, the shock was total and devastating. At noon on April 18th, air raid sirens wailed across Tokyo for the first time in the war. Most Japanese civilians ignored them, assuming it was another drill. After all, everyone knew American bombers couldn't possibly reach the home islands. The military had assured them of this repeatedly. Then the bombs began to fall. Doolittle's raiders struck Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. The material damage was relatively light. 50 people were killed, several hundred injured. A few factories were hit, some oil tanks set ablaze. In purely military terms, the raid accomplished little. But psychologically, the impact was seismic. The Japanese people had been told their homeland was invulnerable. The military had promised that American forces would never threaten the sacred soil of Japan itself. Now, American bombers had appeared over the Imperial Palace, over the Naval Ministry, over the factories and shipyards that were the sinews of Japan's war machine. The Emperor himself had been put at risk. This was unthinkable, unacceptable. The military's prestige, its fundamental promise to protect the nation, had been shattered in a single afternoon. For Yamamoto, the Doolittle Raid was a personal catastrophe. As commander of the combined fleet, the defense of the home islands fell ultimately on his shoulders. The raid vindicated every warning he'd given about American determination and resourcefulness. It proved that his timeline for achieving peace was, if anything, optimistic. The Americans weren't soft. They weren't demoralized. They were coming for Japan, and they would find ways to strike that no one had anticipated. The raid also demolished whatever slim chance existed for negotiated peace. The Japanese military and political establishment couldn't seek peace negotiations now. Not after American bombers had humiliated them in front of their own people. Any talk of peace would be seen as weakness, as capitulation to an enemy that had just attacked the homeland. But the Doolittle Raid's most significant impact was strategic. It forced a fundamental change in Japanese war planning. In the aftermath of the raid, the question everyone in Tokyo was asking was simple and terrifying. Where had those bombers come from? Japanese intelligence correctly concluded they'd been launched from American carriers. That meant American carriers had approached within a few hundred miles of Japan undetected. It meant they could do it again. And next time, instead of 16 bombers dropping a few tons of explosives, there might be hundreds of carrier aircraft striking simultaneously. The Imperial General Staff convened emergency meetings. The Navy's prestige was on the line. Yamamoto's earlier plan to attack Midway Island suddenly gained powerful support. If American carriers could be lured into a decisive battle and destroyed, the threat to the homeland would be eliminated. The defensive perimeter would be secure. Japan could consolidate its conquests and build the impregnable empire that would force America to negotiate. Yamamoto threw himself into planning for Midway with renewed urgency. The operation had to succeed. Everything depended on it. But the very pressure to act quickly, to restore the Navy's reputation after the Doolittle humiliation, led to fatal errors in planning and preparation. The Midway operation was rushed. Intelligence was incomplete. Assumptions were made about American capabilities and intentions that proved disastrously wrong. The Japanese plan was complex, dividing forces in ways that prevented mutual support. And perhaps most critically, Japanese planners underestimated the Americans, assuming that the shock of Pearl Harbor and the subsequent string of defeats had left the US Navy demoralized and ineffective. They were wrong on every count. On June 4, 1942, less than 7 weeks after the Doolittle Raid, Japanese and American carrier forces clashed near Midway Island in what would become the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War. In the span of 5 minutes, American dive bombers struck 3 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, setting them ablaze with bombs that detonated aircraft and ordnance on their hangar decks. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, was destroyed later that day. By the time the smoke cleared, Japan had lost 4 of its 6 large fleet carriers, the very ships that had struck Pearl Harbor. Hundreds of experienced aircrew, the elite of Japanese naval aviation, went down with their ships. The trained pilots who survived faced a grim reality. Japan's carrier aviation training program couldn't replace losses at anything approaching the rate America could. The Midway disaster was kept secret from the Japanese public and even from much of the military. Only the highest levels of the Navy knew the full extent of the catastrophe, but the strategic implications couldn't be hidden. Japan's offensive operations ground to a halt. The planned invasions of Fiji, Samoa, and New Caledonia were cancelled. The assault on Port Moresby had to be postponed indefinitely. Meanwhile, the Americans, emboldened by their Midway victory, began planning their first offensive operation. They would strike at an obscure island in the Solomons where Japanese forces were building an airfield. The island was called Guadalcanal, and the battle for it would become a 6-month struggle that drained Japanese resources and morale. The connection between the Doolittle Raid and these subsequent events is direct and undeniable. Without the raid on Tokyo, the pressure to strike at Midway wouldn't have been so intense. The operation might have been delayed, better planned, executed with more care. Or perhaps the Japanese would have pursued Yamamoto's Indian Ocean strategy instead, or the Australia plan, either of which might have succeeded where Midway failed. But the Doolittle Raid forced Japan's hand. It demanded an immediate, decisive response. And in seeking that response, Japan committed its precious carrier strength to a battle it couldn't afford to lose, and lost anyway. The human cost of the Doolittle Raid extended beyond the battle itself. Of the 80 airmen who flew the mission, all but 1 crew survived the launch and the bombing runs over Japan. But reaching China proved nearly impossible. Most crews ran out of fuel and either crash-landed or bailed out over Chinese territory. 1 crew, running desperately low on fuel, diverted to the Soviet Union, where they were interned for more than a year. The Japanese, humiliated by the raid, sought revenge. They launched a massive search operation in the Chinese provinces where Doolittle's crews had come down. Chinese civilians and military personnel who had helped the American airmen were hunted down. The Japanese military's response was savage and disproportionate. An estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians were killed in retribution for aiding the raiders. 8 of Doolittle's men were captured by Japanese forces. They were taken to Tokyo, given a show trial, and sentenced to death. 3 were executed by firing squad. The others had their sentences commuted to life imprisonment, but faced years of torture and starvation in Japanese prison camps. Doolittle himself believed the raid had been a failure. When he landed in China, his aircraft was destroyed, scattered across a rural hillside. He'd lost all 16 bombers. None would fly again. He expected to be court-martialed when he returned to the United States. Instead, he was promoted 2 ranks to brigadier general and awarded the Medal of Honor. Because while Doolittle judged his mission by the narrow metric of aircraft lost and targets destroyed, Roosevelt and the American military leadership understood the raid's true significance. It proved America could strike back. It boosted American morale at a crucial moment. And perhaps most importantly, it provoked Japan into strategic decisions that would ultimately prove fatal. Admiral Yamamoto had been right about almost everything. He'd warned that Japan could only maintain its early advantages for a year and a half. He'd insisted that political leadership was needed to convert military victories into negotiated peace. He'd understood that America's industrial and human resources would eventually overwhelm Japan if the war dragged on. But the Doolittle Raid ensured the war would drag on. It guaranteed there would be no negotiated settlement, no face-saving peace agreement. It forced Japan into increasingly desperate offensive operations that squandered resources and lives, and it set in motion the chain of events that led to Midway, Guadalcanal, and the slow, grinding American advance across the Pacific. In June 1942, as Japanese forces reeled from the Midway disaster, the Americans were already preparing their counterstroke. Vice Admiral Robert Gormley had been appointed to command the South Pacific Force. His mission was to stop Japanese expansion and begin pushing them back. The intelligence flowing to American commanders painted an increasingly concerning picture. The Japanese were consolidating their hold on the Solomon Islands. They'd established a seaplane base at Tulagi and were building up forces in New Guinea. Most alarmingly, reconnaissance aircraft spotted construction of an airfield on Guadalcanal. If that airfield became operational, Japanese bombers would dominate the skies over the South Pacific, threatening Australia itself. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, understood the stakes. He'd been pushing for a counter-offensive even before Midway, and the victory there gave him the leverage he needed. King proposed a three-phase operation. First, seize Tulagi and the unfinished airfield on Guadalcanal. Second, advance through the Solomons toward the major Japanese base at Rabaul. Third, assault Rabaul itself and establish American control over the region. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, had his own plans. He wanted massive reinforcements, including aircraft carriers, thousands of planes, and multiple divisions, to assault Rabaul directly. The Joint Chiefs of Staff rejected this as too ambitious, too resource-intensive. Instead, they gave Phase 1 to Admiral King and the Navy. MacArthur would take over in subsequent phases. The planning for what would become the Guadalcanal invasion was hasty and plagued with problems. Admiral Gormley, pessimistic by nature, believed the operation was being rushed. He flew to Melbourne to meet with MacArthur, and both men agreed the attack should be postponed. They sent a message to Washington recommending delay. Admiral King's response was unequivocal. No, the invasion would proceed as planned. The Japanese were building that airfield, and every day of delay brought it closer to completion. Once operational, it would make any invasion vastly more difficult and costly. The American force assembled for the invasion was impressive on paper. 75 ships, including 3 aircraft carriers, multiple cruisers and destroyers, and transports carrying 19,000 Marines. But the actual preparation was chaotic. Supplies were loaded haphazardly in California and had to be sorted and reloaded in New Zealand, where dock facilities were limited. The rehearsal at Koru Island was, in the words of Marine General Alexander Vandegrift, a complete bust. Only a third of the assault troops managed to get ashore, and they had no idea what to do once they landed. There was no time for a second rehearsal. By late July, American intelligence confirmed that the Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal was nearly complete. The invasion force sailed on July 31st, heading for the Solomons. On the Japanese side, the build-up continued unaware of the approaching danger. Major General Tomitaro Hari South Seas Force was focused on New Guinea, preparing for renewed assaults on Port Moresby. Japanese air power concentrated on supporting these operations. At Rabaul, the main Japanese base in the region, no one suspected an American amphibious assault was imminent. Admiral Yamamoto himself was back in Japanese waters, his flagship anchored at Hashira. He was planning the next phase of operations in leisurely fashion, assuming the Americans were still reeling from their earlier defeats. The idea that they might launch a major offensive operation so soon after Midway seemed absurd. Japanese search planes flew limited patrols, hampered by cloudy weather. On August 4th and 5th, the American Armada steamed through overcast skies, unseen and unsuspected. On August 6th, rain squalls concealed the fleet for much of the day. At dawn on August 7th, the sky cleared. At 5:30 a.m., the American fleet went to general quarters. At 6 o'clock a.m., carrier aircraft launched for their strikes. The Japanese at Tulagi, Kavutu, and Guadalcanal had no warning. At 6:12 a.m., a frantic radio message went out from Tulagi. Enemy heavy bombardment in progress. The message reached Rabaul, the 4th Fleet, the 6th Fleet, the 8th Fleet, Admiral Yamamoto, and Imperial headquarters. Then contact was lost. American carrier fighters swept the skies, encountering no opposition. They destroyed seaplanes at their moorings, strafed buildings, bombed installations. At Kavutu, 9 float planes, a 4-engine flying boat, and 8 seaplanes were destroyed. Not a single Japanese aircraft survived the initial assault. Meanwhile, naval gunfire pounded the landing beaches. Fires erupted along the shore. An oil dump exploded, sending flames leaping into the sky. At 8 o'clock a.m., landing craft began moving toward Guadalcanal's north shore, east of Lunga Point. The Marines landing on Guadalcanal encountered virtually no resistance. The Japanese, Mostly construction troops rather than combat soldiers had fled into the hills. The Marines moved cautiously through abandoned positions. In one tent, they found a breakfast table with food still on the plates, chopsticks dropped beside half-filled rice bowls. The Japanese had left so quickly they hadn't even finished eating. By the afternoon of August 7th, Marines were approaching the nearly completed airfield. The ease of the advance led to dangerous overconfidence. "I wish those Japanese would come out and fight," one Marine complained. "All they do is run into the jungle." But across the channel at Tulagi, a very different battle was unfolding. There, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion encountered about 250 Japanese troops of the Yokohama Air Base Detachment. These were experienced, dedicated fighters who had prepared defensive positions in the island's rugged terrain. Edson's raiders were among the toughest troops in the American military. Volunteers chosen from the elite Marine Corps and trained under Spartan conditions. But the fighting on Tulagi tested them to their limits. The Japanese had constructed dugouts and rock emplacements on hillsides, creating interlocking fields of fire. Snipers were everywhere, in trees, behind rocks, in buildings. The raiders learned hard lessons that first day. Japanese snipers would let American forward elements pass, then open fire from behind. This almost always meant death for the sniper, but usually not before he'd caused several casualties. The Marines learned that the small 25 caliber Japanese rifle rounds were more likely to wound than kill, which from the Japanese perspective was effective, since caring for the wounded consumed resources and manpower. Progress on Tulagi was measured in yards, each position having to be reduced individually with grenades, dynamite, and close quarters fighting. That night, the Japanese launched a counterattack, breaking through the Marine perimeter at 10:30 p.m. Hand-to-hand fighting raged in the darkness. Marines fought with rifles, grenades, and knives. The Japanese pushed within 50 yards of Colonel Edson's command post before being thrown back. One Marine company lost half its non-commissioned officers in the night's fighting. At Guvutu and Tanambogo, connected islands hosting a Japanese seaplane base, the fighting was even more intense. The Japanese, about 500 strong, had fortified the small hills dominating the landing beaches. Marines landing in the second and third waves came under heavy fire. The third wave took casualties before even reaching shore. American tanks landed to support the assault, but Japanese soldiers attacked them with desperate courage, jamming crowbars under the treads, throwing grenades, trying to set them ablaze with gasoline-soaked rags. One tank commander opened his hatch to employ the machine gun and killed 23 Japanese before one scrambled up the side and stabbed him to death. Another Japanese then threw burning rags inside, destroying the tank. Reinforcements called from Florida Island arrived at dusk, but a naval bombardment preceding their landing accidentally hit a fuel dump, lighting up the beach like noon. Japanese machine gunners had perfect targets silhouetted against the sea. 2 boatloads of Marines reached shore, but the third boat's coxswain was killed and the boat turned away, followed by the others who thought there had been a change in orders. The stranded Marines took cover behind a concrete pier, pinned down by Japanese fire from the hillside positions. It took until 4 o'clock a.m. on August 8th before the situation was sorted out and reinforcements secured the causeway connecting the 2 islands. When the fighting finally ended on Tulagi, Guvutu, and Tanambogo, the butcher's bill was sobering. On Tulagi, 90 Marine casualties against 200 Japanese killed. The garrison of 250 had fought to virtually the last man. Only 3 surrendered, and the rest who weren't killed swam to Florida Island to continue fighting. On Guvutu and Tanambogo, 250 Marine casualties against 500 Japanese who fought to the death. Not one surrendered. These battles provided American forces their first real taste of what fighting the Japanese would entail. The suicidal determination, the refusal to surrender, the willingness to die in hopeless situations rather than give up. It was unlike anything American troops had encountered before. Meanwhile, at Rabaul, the Japanese response was swift. At 8:30 a.m. on August 7th, 27 twin-engine Betty bombers took off, escorted by 18 Zero fighters. They'd been loaded for strikes against Australian forces in New Guinea, so they carried bombs instead of torpedoes. They climbed to 13,000 feet and turned south along the coast. American carrier fighters intercepted them near Florida Island. The Grumman F-4F Wildcats, flying at 18,000 feet, dove on the formation. In the initial attack, several bombers were shot down or damaged, but then the Zeros joined the fight, and the Americans learned painfully that the Japanese fighters were superior in speed, maneuverability, and climb rate. The F-4F pilots had been briefed on the Zero's capabilities and instructed to avoid turning dogfights. Instead, they were to make diving attacks and then escape into cloud cover. But in the chaos of combat, several pilots were caught in turning fights and shot down. 3 F-4Fs were lost in one engagement alone. Other American fighters had better success. They discovered that while the Zero could outturn them, the F-4F could absorb tremendous punishment thanks to its armor and sturdy construction. Zeros would burst into flames from just a few hits, while F-4Fs could fly home with dozens of bullet holes. The bomber formation pressed on toward the American fleet. At 2:30 p.m., coast watchers on Bougainville had sent warning. 20 bombers heading southeast. The message was relayed through Pearl Harbor back to the fleet. Ships went to battle stations. Carrier fighters climbed to altitude. When the Japanese arrived over Guadalcanal at noon, they faced a wall of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of American fighters. Of the 20 bombers that reached the target area, all but one were shot down. The only damage to American ships was a bomb hit on the destroyer Muckford. But the cost of this defensive victory was troubling. Against the bombers, American fighters were effective. Against the Zeros, the results were mixed at best. 21 American carrier aircraft were lost in that first day's fighting. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the carrier task force, had been worried about losses from the start. At the planning conference aboard his flagship Saratoga on July 28th, he'd announced he would only support the landings for 2 days before withdrawing his carriers. Now, with aircraft losses mounting and Japanese air power at Rabaul still largely intact, Fletcher felt vindicated in his caution. On the evening of August 8th, Fletcher requested permission to withdraw his carriers. He didn't wait for a reply. By 6 p.m., he was pulling his task force away from Guadalcanal. Admiral Richmond Helly Turner, commanding the amphibious force, was appalled. Fletcher's withdrawal would leave the transports defenseless against Japanese air attack. Worse, the supplies for the Marines were still being unloaded. Mountains of equipment, ammunition, and food crowded the beaches, but much more remained in the ship's holds. Turner had no choice but to prepare for withdrawal as well. But first, he'd have to get through the night. And unknown to Turner, a powerful Japanese surface force was already racing toward Guadalcanal through the darkness. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commanding the Japanese 8th Fleet at Rabaul, had reacted immediately to news of the invasion. He gathered every warship available, 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer. Not a massive force, but if handled skillfully, more than enough to devastate the American transports anchored off Guadalcanal. Mikawa's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Steam south at moderate speed to arrive after midnight. Make a high-speed run through what would soon be known as Iron Bottom Sound. Destroy the transports and their escorts with gunfire and torpedoes. Withdraw before American carrier aircraft could arrive at dawn. The Japanese had spent years perfecting night combat tactics. They had superior optics for night fighting. Their Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes were the best in the world, with longer range and larger warheads than anything the Americans had. Japanese crews had trained endlessly in night surface combat, while American naval doctrine largely ignored it. As Mikawa's force steamed south on August 7th and 8th, it was spotted twice. A B-17 crew saw the ships near Rabaul. An American submarine encountered them in St. George's Channel. Both sightings were reported, but the significance wasn't understood. Ships moving in and out of Rabaul were routine. Nobody put the pieces together to realize a major surface force was heading directly for Guadalcanal. The American search plan for August 8th should have detected Mikawa's force, but it didn't. A crucial search of the slot, the waterway between the Solomon Islands that led straight to Guadalcanal, was never flown. A communications mix-up between Admiral Turner's flagship, Admiral McCain's headquarters, and the seaplane tender that was supposed to conduct the search meant the patrol was never launched. So as darkness fell on August 8th, Mikawa's force approached Guadalcanal completely undetected. American cruisers and destroyers had been stationed to guard the approaches, but they weren't expecting a night attack. Their crews were tired after 2 days of constant operations. Many men were at a reduced state of readiness, catching sleep when they could. At 1:43 a.m. on August 9th, Japanese lookouts spotted the American destroyer Blue on patrol south of Savo Island. Mikawa's ships went to battle stations, but the Blue never saw them. The Japanese force slipped past in the darkness. 13 minutes later, the Japanese spotted the American Southern Screening Force, 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers on patrol. Mikawa's force launched torpedoes and opened fire at point-blank range. The Battle of Savo Island lasted less than an hour. When it ended, 4 Allied heavy cruisers had been sunk or were sinking: the Australian Canberra and the Americans Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes. More than 1,000 Allied sailors were dead. Another cruiser, Chicago, was damaged. The Japanese had achieved one of the most one-sided victories in naval history. They'd suffered minor damage to 3 cruisers and lost 58 men. Then, fearing American carrier aircraft would arrive at dawn, Mikawa withdrew. It was the right tactical decision, but a strategic mistake. The American transports, packed with supplies and unable to maneuver in the confined waters, sat defenseless just a few miles away. Mikawa could have destroyed them all, stranding the Marines on Guadalcanal without food, ammunition, or heavy equipment. Instead, he chose preservation of his force over distraction of the enemies, and the opportunity was lost. The Battle of Savo Island was a devastating blow to American prestige and a grim lesson in the cost of unpreparedness. But it didn't stop the Guadalcanal operation. Admiral Turner withdrew his transports the next day, leaving the Marines with only a fraction of their supplies, but the foothold had been established. Over the following 6 months, Guadalcanal became a grinding battle of attrition. The Japanese poured reinforcements onto the island via fast destroyer runs down the slot, missions that became known as the Tokyo Express. The Americans did the same, building up forces and supplies. Naval battles raged in the waters around the island. Aircraft from the completed airfield, now named Henderson Field after a Marine aviator killed at Midway, dueled with Japanese bombers from aboard. Both sides suffered terrible losses. Ships, aircraft, and men were fed into the Guadalcanal meat grinder. But Japan, with its limited industrial base and smaller population, couldn't sustain losses at the rate America could. Every Japanese carrier pilot killed was nearly irreplaceable. Every ship sunk represented a significant portion of Japanese naval strength. Meanwhile, American shipyards were launching new vessels at an accelerating pace, and American training programs were producing pilots and sailors by the thousands. By February 1943, the Japanese evacuated Guadalcanal, withdrawing their surviving forces under cover of darkness. The Americans had won, but at staggering cost. But for Japan, the loss was catastrophic. It marked the end of Japanese expansion and the beginning of an inexorable American advance. And all of it, the entire chain of events that led from Midway to Guadalcanal to the eventual American victory, traced back in part to that April afternoon when 16 B-25s appeared over Tokyo. The Doolittle Raid didn't win the war. The 80 men who flew that mission didn't destroy Japan's military capability, but they changed the strategic calculus in ways that echoed through the rest of the war. They proved to the American people that Japan could be struck, that the war wasn't hopeless, that American ingenuity and courage could find ways to hit back even in the darkest days. They proved to the Japanese that their homeland wasn't invulnerable, that the vast Pacific wasn't protection enough, that American forces would find ways to bring the war home. And most critically, they forced Japan into strategic decisions driven by emotion rather than calculation. The rush to Midway, the catastrophic carrier losses there, the inability to stop the American landing at Guadalcanal. All of these flowed in part from the psychological impact of seeing American bombers over Tokyo. Admiral Yamamoto had been right. Japan needed to win quickly and negotiate from strength. The Doolittle Raid ensured that would never happen. It guaranteed the war would continue until one side achieved total victory. And given the vast disparity in industrial and human resources between the two nations, the outcome was, in retrospect, inevitable. Yamamoto himself never saw the end. On April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle Raid, his aircraft was intercepted by American P-38 fighters over Bougainville. The Americans had broken Japanese naval codes and knew his exact itinerary. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor, who had warned his countrymen about the dangers of war with America, who had sought desperately for a way to end the war before it consumed Japan, was killed when his plane crashed into the jungle. The Doolittle Raiders who survived the war came home to a country grateful for their courage, but they paid a terrible price for their brief moment over Tokyo. The men executed by the Japanese died far from home, denied even the dignity of proper burial. Those who spent years in Japanese prison camps endured torture and starvation. The Chinese who helped them paid with their lives, 250,000 dead in Japanese reprisals. And yet, for all its cost, the raid accomplished something no conventional military operation could have. It changed the course of the war not through destruction, but through psychology. It forced decisions that led to defeat, It proved that courage and audacity could matter as much as material strength. 75 ships carried 19,000 Marines to Guadalcanal in August 1942, but in a very real sense, their path was cleared by 16 bombers and 80 men who had flown over Tokyo 4 months earlier. The Doolittle Raid didn't change everything, but it changed enough. And in war, sometimes that's all that matters.